On my 18th birthday, a day that should have been filled with joy and celebration, my life took an unexpected and heartbreaking turn. My stepmother, Veronica, orchestrated a plan to force my father into making a difficult decision, to evict me from our family home. The reason behind this harsh ultimatum was her desire to make space for her own unborn child. I stood firm in my refusal to return, especially after uncovering the unsettling truth that my father and Veronica had been embezzling funds that rightfully belonged to my late mother's affluent family. Life hadn't been easy for me lately. As a 44-year-old man, reflecting back on my experiences, I recall the turmoil that began when I turned 18 last week. It was supposed to be a milestone celebrating my transition into adulthood, but instead, my father decided it was the perfect moment to expel me from the house. My mother had tragically passed away when I was only 3 years old due to a devastating accident. Since her untimely death, my father had cycled through numerous girlfriends and experienced several failed relationships. Growing up, it seemed like I was never alone with my father. There was almost always a woman present in our home. During the day, a nanny took care of me while my father was at work, and whenever he returned, he was accompanied by his latest girlfriend. After my mother's death, my father severed all connections with her family. He saw no reason to maintain ties, perhaps believing it was best to distance ourselves from the painful memories of that tragedy. Consequently, my mother's family didn't pursue custody or seek opportunities to visit me, leaving me to grow up primarily in the company of my father and his ever-changing partners. Despite living together, my father never seemed genuinely interested in being a present or affectionate parent. Most of his time was consumed by work or socializing with his current girlfriend, whoever she might be at the time. As a child, I made earnest attempts to forge a bond with my father, hoping for some semblance of love and attention. However, all I ever received was the bare minimum. This lack of affection gradually conditioned me to expect nothing from him, resulting in a childhood that was profoundly lonely and tinged with sadness. Fortunately, there was one bright spot in my life: my grandfather. He was the only other family member who showed consistent support and companionship. Occasionally, he would visit me, providing a sense of family that was otherwise absent. Unfortunately, due to my father's stubbornness, my grandfather couldn't take me in permanently. My father, though distant, never crossed the line into cruelty during my childhood, which meant my grandfather lacked sufficient legal grounds to claim custody. My grandfather's visits were carefully monitored by my father, who limited my time with him to just a few days at a stretch. This strict regulation left me feeling restricted and yearning for more meaningful connections. Despite my father's cold demeanor, he still clung to the idea of keeping me around, even though it often felt like he barely cared. As I grew older, my desire to rebel increased, primarily because I longed to spend more time with my grandfather, who genuinely showed me love and concern beyond the superficial level my father provided. However, my father remained unyielding, dismissing my pleas and reinforcing his authority by insisting that, ultimately, he was the one in charge. My grandfather made several attempts to encourage my father to treat me with the same love and care he did, but nothing ever changed. He also didn't allow me to move in with him, leaving me stuck in a stagnant and unhappy living situation throughout my teenage years. This period marked the nadir of our already strained relationship, and things only spiraled downward further after my father met Veronica. Veronica, a 28-year-old woman, entered our lives as a neighbor's niece. She had been living with our neighbors until her company could provide her with proper accommodation. Shortly after that, she and my father began dating, eventually marrying about a year ago after nearly 8 months of courtship. My father's demeanor towards me had always been indifferent, but once Veronica became a part of our lives, both she and my father grew increasingly hostile towards me. Veronica seemed to harbor a deep-seated resentment towards me from the very beginning, and I was left bewildered as to why. I had done nothing to provoke her. In fact, I had always made an effort to be kind and accommodating. It seemed as though my existence was a constant reminder to Veronica of my father's previous marriage, and she couldn't tolerate that. Her animosity made my home life unbearable. She treated me as if I were a mere servant, assigning me all the household chores despite having a maid to handle them. My father, surprisingly, never intervened or objected to her unfair treatment of me. This oppressive environment made me feel like Cinderella in my own home, overworked, unappreciated, and undervalued. Additionally, Veronica persuaded my father to stop giving me money for outings and social activities, something that had never been an issue before. She convinced him that it was time for me to become financially independent, pushing me to get a part-time job so I could afford to go out with friends and purchase necessities like new clothes and shoes. This shift was particularly painful because, although I understood the importance of responsibility, it felt like another way Veronica was stripping away my sense of self-worth and autonomy. She was determined to make my life a living nightmare, and I desperately longed for the day I could leave for college and escape this toxic household. I confided in my grandfather about the mistreatment I was enduring since Veronica moved in. He assured me that he had spoken to my father about the situation and promised to take action. However, nothing changed, and over time, I lost hope that my grandfather could alleviate my suffering. My grandfather was a comforting presence, someone I could vent to and who would listen patiently, but his inability to effect change left me feeling trapped. Eventually, I resigned myself to the fact that I would have to endure living with my father and Veronica until I could afford to move out on my own. Then, just a week ago, on the morning of my 18th birthday, my father and Veronica dropped the bombshell that shattered any remaining hope of a normal celebration. They informed me that they had made the difficult decision to evict me from the house because Veronica had discovered she was pregnant. They needed my room to prepare a nursery for their new baby, and they wanted me out immediately to make room for their expanding family. I had been looking forward to celebrating my birthday with my friends, perhaps indulging in a few beers and enjoying a fun night out, especially since I had been saving up money to treat myself. The news of my eviction was a devastating blow, and I felt my birthday being ruined by their selfishness. Veronica attempted to soften the blow by pretending to be concerned and hopeful, suggesting that this might be an opportunity for me to grow and become more independent. However, to me, it felt like a calculated move by a manipulative person intent on ousting me from my home. Determined to handle the situation with composure, I tried to remain rational. I knew that showing panic, crying, or throwing a tantrum would be futile against people who had shown me no sympathy or understanding. I informed them that legally, they couldn't evict me without proper notice and that I needed some time to find alternative accommodation. Admittedly, I wasn't entirely certain about the legal specifics, but I hoped to stall them for a few months until I could secure my own place. My father, however, was unimpressed with my attempt to buy time. He claimed to have everything sorted out with his lawyer and expressed doubt that I had the means or resources to challenge the eviction legally. He was correct, I lacked the financial stability and legal knowledge to contest their decision effectively. In a last-ditch effort to negotiate, I offered to pay rent if I could stay in the house. Veronica dismissed this idea outright, stating that rent wasn't the issue. Her primary concern was to have an undisturbed environment for her pregnancy, free from what she deemed unnecessary complications. Feeling cornered and realizing that my attempts to reason were in vain, I reluctantly accepted that they were resolute in their decision to evict me. With a heavy heart, I went to my room to begin packing my belongings, preparing to leave the only home I had known. The uncertainty of whether my grandfather could take me in weighed heavily on my mind. My grandfather had always struggled financially, having been a high school science teacher before retiring. His gambling addiction in his 20s had severely depleted his savings, leaving him dependent on my father for support. This financial instability was one of the primary reasons I hadn't moved in with him earlier, despite my desire for a more nurturing environment. Despite his modest living situation, I didn't want to burden my grandfather further, so I made the difficult decision to approach him once more. I explained the predicament I was in, revealing that my father and Veronica had decided to evict me without any consideration for my well-being. For about a year, I had been trying to remain hopeful, but deep down, I had always feared this day would come. Additionally, the looming concern of how I would fund my upcoming college education added to my overwhelming anxiety. Overcome with emotion, I began to cry, prompting my grandfather to take decisive action. He abruptly excused himself to make a phone call, leaving me feeling confused and uncertain. After nearly an hour and a half of anxious waiting, he returned and delivered surprising news. I no longer needed to worry about my living situation or my college expenses because he had arranged for me to live with him. When I inquired about the sudden change, he remained tight-lipped, insisting that it was not a matter for me to concern myself with at that moment. Despite my curiosity, I chose not to press further and instead followed his advice to go out and enjoy my birthday with friends, leaving my worries behind for the time being. Taking his counsel to heart, I decided to make the most of my day. I went out with my friends, trying to keep my phone on silent to avoid any interruptions from my father, who I feared might try to interfere with my evening plans. I didn't check my messages until I returned to my grandfather's place around 10 p.m. To my astonishment, my father had been trying to reach me all evening, using text messages and even calling from Veronica's number. It seemed he had developed a sudden change of heart, pleading with me to come back home. I chose not to respond immediately, waiting until the next morning to assert my decision firmly. When I finally addressed him, I didn't hold back my feelings. I told him that I couldn't return because he had never treated me well and that I wasn't willing to sacrifice my newfound happiness. Veronica's treatment had been even more unbearable, and the thought of returning to that toxic environment was something I couldn't bear. I emphasized that, now that I was an adult, I had the right to choose where I lived and that he had no authority to force me back, especially after the way he and Veronica had expelled me just the day before. After sending those definitive texts, my father responded with a lengthy and sorrowful message. He confessed that he had been reflecting privately and had come across an old photo album of mine in his office, which stirred up memories of promises he had made to my mother. This reflection made him feel as though he was failing to honor his commitments to her by prioritizing Veronica and their unborn child over me. He pleaded for one last chance to be a better father, attributing his actions to the fear and uncertainty brought on by the news of Veronica's pregnancy. He expressed deep regret for having complied with Veronica's demands without considering my feelings and insisted that he wanted to make amends and welcome me back into the family. I chose not to respond to his message, recognizing it as another attempt at manipulation. However, the situation left me perplexed and conflicted. A week had passed, and his constant texting continued, with him reminiscing about good times from my childhood and apologizing for his initial neglect. Initially, I dismissed it as another ploy to get me back under his control, but my feelings became more complicated over time. I confided in my grandfather, seeking his perspective, but he advised me not to be swayed by my father's actions, clearly frustrated by his son's behavior. Despite feeling a pang of sympathy for my father's newfound desire to reconnect, I remained steadfast in my decision not to return home. My rational mind understood that leaving was the best choice for my well-being, but an emotional part of me still yearned to see if my father would genuinely change. His persistent attempts to reach out, including a heartfelt plea where he claimed he would beg on his knees for me to come back, made me feel guilty. Yet, deep down, I knew that returning to my father's house would only reignite the cycle of manipulation and neglect. In an update to my situation, I discovered the true reason behind my father's desperation to have me back. It wasn't solely about me, it was more about maintaining his lifestyle and the financial support he received from my mother's wealthy family. Upon sitting down with my grandfather, I shared how my father had been relentlessly trying to lure me back home, making me feel like a terrible person for refusing. My grandfather, after some hesitation, finally opened up and revealed a long-held secret. My father's support had been largely funded by my mother's family without my knowledge. He explained that my mother's family had been financially backing my upbringing, allowing me to attend private school and enjoy a level of comfort that my father never willingly provided. My father had concealed this support, pretending that he was the sole provider, because he despised my mother's side of the family and didn't want their wealth to influence our relationship. This revelation shed light on why my father had been so resistant to sharing custody and why Veronica had pushed me out once she discovered her pregnancy. He feared that acknowledging the financial support would undermine his control over me. Feeling betrayed by my grandfather's secrecy, I learned that my mother's family had chosen to step in and ensure I was placed with my grandfather after years of mistreatment. They were upset with my father for allowing this situation to persist without intervention. My grandfather had always been the intermediary between my father's reluctance to engage with my mother's family and their decision to support me directly once my eviction occurred. He had kept this a secret to protect my father's pride and avoid confrontation, but ultimately, my grandfather couldn't remain silent any longer. This newfound knowledge solidified my decision to sever ties with my father. I realized that his attempts to manipulate me were not out of genuine remorse but rather a desperate bid to continue benefiting from the financial support provided by my mother's family. His facade of wanting to be a better father was merely a means to regain access to the resources he had been receiving without transparency. Determined not to fall victim to his manipulations, I blocked my father's number and cut off all communication, even when he tried reaching out through Veronica's phone. Her attempt to play the grieving wife and deceive me only reinforced my resolve to stay away from their toxic influence. In the days that followed, I found solace in the truth I had uncovered. My grandfather, recognizing the severity of the situation, confirmed that my father's actions were driven by financial motives rather than any genuine change of heart. When Veronica reached out pretending to be concerned and emotional, I saw through her act and refused to engage, ultimately blocking her number as well. This decisive action brought me a sense of relief, knowing that I had taken control of my own life and freed myself from their manipulative grasp. As time passed, I decided to embrace the opportunity to connect with my mother's family, despite their initial reluctance to meet me. Driven by a desire to understand my heritage and express gratitude for their unseen support, I enlisted my grandfather's help to arrange a meeting. After much persuasion, my mother's family agreed to fly down and meet me for the first time in person. Meeting them was a profound experience. My grandfather accompanied me, providing the support I needed as I navigated this new and emotional encounter. The meeting was filled with tears and awkwardness as we all grappled with the emotions of finally coming together. Despite the initial awkwardness, the genuine care and interest they showed in my life were heartwarming. They assured me that my college funds were well taken care of, a relief I hadn't expected. Our time together was filled with meaningful conversations, and plans were made to continue building our relationship with monthly meetings, whether I traveled to their home or they came to mine. This newfound connection with my mother's family brought a sense of completeness and belonging that I had longed for throughout my tumultuous upbringing. It was a significant step toward healing and forging a supportive network that would help me move forward with confidence and hope for the future.